Good morning, everybody. I'm sure the ranking member is inbound and will be here shortly, but to respect your time and move forward, we're just going to go ahead and get started. The roundtable will come to order. I'm pleased to welcome our participants today to our first subcommittee roundtable this Congress. I look forward to working with the ranking member, Dina Titus, and other members of the subcommittee on this and other issues. These roundtables provide an opportunity for this subcommittee, federal agencies, and the private sector to have meaningful discussions. We're not bound by the time requirements, so we can just have an open give and take here. We know prior subcommittee roundtable discussions proved to be effective in getting agencies to reduce space and think more strategically to reduce costs to the taxpayer. The goal of today's roundtable is for us to discuss the lay of the land, so to speak, of the federal real estate circumstances. Ultimately, we need to make sure we are smart in our federal real estate decisions. Federal real property continues to be on the Government Accountability Office's high-risk list, and even before COVID, we had far too much empty space in our portfolio. Unfortunately, the ongoing telework policies have only made the problem worse. Here are some basic facts, and I think you'll see them on the screen there. Occupancy in the D.C. area remains below 50% of pre-pandemic levels. 30% of federal employees with remote work agreements live outside their assigned region. I don't have to read it for you, but you kind of get it there. 30% of employees are expected to retire in the next 5 years, which is an interesting fact to consider. More than 50% of General Services Administration or GSA's leases are expiring in the next 5 years, which is another important fact to consider. This is an opportunity to take a look at that and see what we can do to make sure that we're on track with what we need, what's available, we're paying the right price, et cetera. We're getting growing reports of what's called shadow space in both owned and leased buildings, space that's just simply vacant. And I don't think that's acceptable to anybody here, regardless of your political affiliation or what you think is the right way to go. Just having empty space or the shadow space is unacceptable. All of the circumstances set the stage for an opportunity to right-size federal space and shed unneeded real estate. If the agencies aren't using it, quite frankly, they should be happy to give it up and not have to deal with it. I know the subcommittee, GSA, GAO, and private sector experts have been talking about this for a long time. While there's been some progress, I believe there is much more we can and must do. Traditionally, this is a bipartisan issue and should be a no-brainer, and I hope it can remain that way. If the space isn't needed, let's not have it on the books. Underused and empty space not only waste taxpayer dollars that can be used otherwise, or returned, but can have a negative economic effect on the communities where they are located. We need to get a handle on this, and we need to know what the baseline is now. What is the state of federal real estate so we can identify opportunities, what the hurdles are, and where we want to end up. Today, I want to focus our discussion on getting the lay of the land, including what does the real estate market look like right now, and what are the current market trends in office space. And that's not necessarily just in D.C., but we got to have an idea across the country. And what are the challenges and opportunities? I hope the roundtable discussion today will better identify how the committee can focus efforts to optimize space and save money. Now, before we begin our discussion, I'd like to recognize the ranking member, but in her absence at this time, we're going to keep moving, and when she gets here, we'll take a break and get her remarks. I'm going to explain how the roundtable works. It's to have a discussion, so I urge you to join as we move through the topics. Joanna here, the staff director, is going to keep a queue, so to speak, so if you've got something to say, we just hope you'd raise your hand and point to us or whatever during the discussion. We won't stop it, but we'll put you in the queue and then get on to you. We're politicians a lot of times, so we have a tendency to not recognize when we're talking too long, so we just encourage you, there's no clock here, and you want to get to something, but you can get that kind of that social presence of, might be talking too long, let's give it up to somebody else, and we'll come back to you, whatever. I'd like each participant to briefly go around the table and introduce yourself or your organization's role, if you're with an organization in the federal or state realm. And then I'll start with a few questions to get things going and guide us, but I want this to be an open dialogue, and I don't want to monopolize this time. So I'm going to start with Nina Albert at the GSA, and if you can just introduce yourself and talk about your role and so on and so forth, and then we'll go around the block here. Go ahead, Nina.
Good morning. Thank you so much for your time this morning, as well as the opportunity to talk about what I believe is incredibly interesting, complicated, and important topic. My name's Nina Albert. I'm the Commissioner of the Public Building Service within the General Services Administration. As GSA, we manage real estate for 24 CFO Act agencies, so the civilian side of the government. We have all different types of assets: office, land ports of entry, federal courthouses, labs, and et cetera, so warehouses. But the moment that we're in right now is really trying to understand what the opportunity is to create a more modernized experience for federal employees when they use the office and federal facilities, for a better experience for the American public when they come to federal facilities, but also to optimize the portfolio and ultimately save money. I have 5,500 people in my care across the country. We have federal facilities in 2,200 communities across the U.S., and I take that responsibility very seriously, and I'm happy to be here this morning.
Awesome. Ma'am.
My name is Kay Sargent. I'm the Global Director of Workplace at HOK, which is one of the world's largest architectural firms. We have 26 offices all around the world, and I get to work with our corporate clients that have multiple projects in multiple locations, millions of square feet of space. So in my 38-year career, I have always focused on GSA and government works, but also with the corporate, private sector clients. And we've held multiple roundtables all around the world to really understand what's truly happening and to have some really honest conversations with business leaders about what they're seeing today.
The Honorable Michael Capuano. Welcome back. Thank you. David?
Hi, my name is David Maroney. I'm an acting director with GAO, where I oversee our work on managing federal real property. And as the chairman already noted, that has been a long-standing area of concern for GAO. We have a 20-year body of work looking at how to better manage federal real property resources, including ongoing work, many recommendations in this space, which we'll be happy to discuss today and share going forward. Definitely a high priority issue for us at GAO as we try and look at how to save taxpayers' money and make government work more effectively. So thank you for the opportunity.
Awesome. Chad?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Congressman. And the rest of the members of the committee. It's a pleasure to be here today. My name is Chad Habib. I'm with FD Stonewater, a real estate firm based here in Washington, D.C., where we focus on investing, developing, and leasing commercial real estate with a particular focus on federally leased assets as well as assets leased by state and local government. We've partnered with the government on over 35 build-to-suit projects in a number of regions and a number of entities. Over the last 5 years alone, we've completed 10 million square feet of leasing transactions across the country with a large body of work here in D.C. And we're happy to tell you what we're seeing today on that landscape and hopefully come up with some solutions to help save taxpayer dollars and support our agencies. Thank you.
Great. All right, Derek?
Good morning. I'm Derek Mayshore, and I am with CBRE. CBRE is the world's largest real estate firm, and we have a robust public and private practice. My role at CBRE involves private sector firms. We have, my team represents occupiers of space, so we have a very clear sense, particularly coming through the pandemic, of what the C-suite and the private sector is thinking about when it comes to managing real estate space, office space, getting folks back to work. So I'm hopeful that I can provide that private sector perspective this morning.
Great to have you. All right, Timothy?
Good morning. My name is Tim Horn. I'm with Boyd Watterson Asset Management. Boyd Watterson is an SEC-registered investment advisor that manages private funds that own buildings leased to federal and state governments. So we're a large owner of buildings leased to the federal government. Prior to joining Boyd Watterson, I spent 27 years at the General Services Administration in a variety of senior positions, including 1 year as the acting administrator of GSA. So pleasure to be here and look forward to the conversation.
Well, I sure appreciate you all taking the time to be here in Washington, D.C. For those of us who don't live here and don't work here, this can be it's not necessarily very welcome. The halls are wide, there's nowhere to sit, there's nowhere to be, you're just, you got to get through, there's nowhere to park, it's a hassle. So thank you for coming. So I'm going to start with just some questions, maybe to cue things up, and then we'll get the queue filled up. So anytime you have a question, just raise your hand. We're going to keep on going with the question or the discussion at hand, but Joanna here is going to put you in the queue so we make sure we get to everybody. Okay, to our participants in the private sector on this one, what are the trends in the private sector? How are the private sector employees approaching space that may help inform this discussion? Anybody? Yes, ma'am.
So we're seeing about 70% of our clients have adopted a hybrid model. Most of them, quite frankly, honestly, behind the scenes are telling us they need to get their people back to the office. Because as this has gone on, there are some ramifications and some consequences of people not necessarily being together. It's impacted the quality of what's being produced, it's impacted professional development, it's impacted our cities, there's a whole variety of things. And to some degree, working remotely has been successful, and you can be very productive, but just because you can do something doesn't necessarily mean you should, and it's not for everyone. And so there's some people, especially, I'm looking around the table, most of our generation who are more senior, who kind of have tenure, who understand what our jobs are, who have our built-up social capital and our network. But if you ask one of my 5 children how successful working from home was for them, they have a very, very different story. And I find it amazing how we quickly realized that remote learning was a disaster for our children, socially and educationally, but we're not necessarily thinking of the impact of emerging professionals and the impact that not being together is having on their professional development as well.
Anybody? Yeah, go ahead. Just crank in there, man.
Sure. So most of the tenants in our portfolio are federal or state and local tenants, but I can tell you from our experience as a tenant in a building and as a company, We have had to make decisions on our real estate needs moving forward, and we've got about 50 people in our organization, and we've decided that we're going to have a flexible work schedule employed. 3 days a week is mandatory, 2 days a week is flexible, but under that paradigm, obviously, we are exactly what Kay was saying. We're not able to downsize at all, nor will we downsize in that situation. We need people in the office at the same time for meetings, for collaboration, and for training. I think most of our peers are probably in that same category. And when we talk about, when we speak with those tenants who are at the state and local municipality level, they're sort of mirroring the private sector in their thinking, where there seems to be a very deliberate approach to how they're thinking about space needs, who needs to be in the office, when, why, and those trends seem to be mirroring the private sector in terms of occupancy and utilization. I do think it's fair to say that the federal government is a bit of an outlier in that regard, and we see it as a bit more.
In what way? In what ways?
Sure. So obviously, less utilization, less guidelines and guardrails put around flexible work schedules, and it seems in many cases to be an exercise of compliance, meaning if there's a requirement to be in the office for 2 days pay period or 1 day pay period, that's sort of what is met, as opposed to thinking granularly about who needs to be where and when.
So before, if you guys, I'm sure you want to weigh in here, but maybe especially to you, Kay, since you said 70% have this hybrid model, right?
Yeah.
And I don't, is the hybrid model somewhat what Chad described? Can you put any metrics to that? What are the numbers, or does it allow for a reduction in space, or is it essentially, I think what you described is you still need the same space, but it's not full all the time, but because you have the same amount of employees at some point using it, you kind of need the same space. But the other thing, if you can address this, if you know, is productivity or success. Like, it's one thing to be able to work from home, but do you see a reduction in productivity or outcomes or deliverables based on not being in the office as opposed to being? Can you quantify any of that?
Yeah, so let me give you an interesting statistic. People are spending 252% more time on Zoom calls. Okay, what percentage of time do you think that people are on Zoom calls, they're multitasking? 100%? Can we actually multitask? Even though as women, I think we say we can, but the answer is no. And what's happening is people are sitting stagnantly, going from Zoom call to Zoom call to Zoom call. Our bodies were never meant to that, so physically it's draining, mentally it's draining. You're trying to do two things at once. And so Microsoft came out with a report that said 90% of employees think that they're more productive. Only 12% of their managers do. The difference is sitting at your computer, being on your computer, is that really being productive? And that's how most companies measure productivity, is how long you're sitting on your computer. But what is the quality of what is being produced when you're multitasking, trying to do two things at once? And I don't think it's a coincidence that we have such a high rate of poor well-being, burnout, and people just feeling absolutely fried. The other thing that I'll say is that when we go from meeting to meeting to meeting, most important things happen when you leave the meeting and you're talking about it in the hallway outside. We don't have the opportunity to do that anymore. There's no pre-meeting prep. There's nothing that's happening afterwards. We're going from meeting to meeting and flushing, and we don't have any time to think or process and really assimilate what's happening. And so for a lot of people, this has just been an amazingly draining experience, and the quality of what is being produced, what we're hearing from our corporate clients, is they're really concerned about that. And I think they're also concerned about DEIA initiatives, sustainability initiatives, professional development, a lot of those things that are impacting individuals. But what we know is about 21% of people are coming in, 21% are full-time of the people that can work remotely. So let's just say this statistic too. Only 42% of people even have the option to work remotely. 58% of the US workforce, and by the way, we have the highest percentage of people that can work remotely, 58% don't have a choice. So the other thing that this starts to do is create silos from the people that can and the people that can't. And the last thing we need in our society is more silos.
I would support Kay by offering this statistic. At the end of 2021, the number of mandate days in the private sector was 0 to 1. By the end of 2022, the number of mandate days in the private sector had gone to 3. Okay? What we saw in each succeeding quarter was an increase in the number of companies whose management said to its workforce, this isn't how we want to be as a company. And we've seen with each succeeding quarter, the number of mandate days go up. So the majority of companies in the U.S. right now have a 2 to 3 day minimum mandate, and that's up from 0 a year ago. I think that trend will likely continue.
So, sir, to be clear, when you say mandate date, mandated to be
physically in the office. So, our clients include people like Disney and Amazon and Google. And as we speak, Amazon is in the process of going to a majority of the week in the office model starting on May 1. Disney did it maybe 6 months ago, 4-day-a-week mandate. So I think what Kay has spoken to is the clear sense from management in the private sector that all of the things that make a company great require more time together than less. Again, hybrid model, acknowledgement of some need for flexibility, working closely with the workforce and trying to figure out what makes sense. We now know that there are things and ways of working that have evolved. But the thing that is uncontrovertible is the sense from management that it is important to make the statement that we be together.
Tim, did you have something?
I would just say I would certainly defer to the panel on trends in the private sector. My expertise is more on what happens in the public sector and government. And part of my job, we own assets all across the country, and part of my job is to be out talking to the tenants, making sure that they're getting the services that they're entitled to under the lease, making sure that they're happy. And what I hear from the sort of mid-level managers across government, the people that really make it all work, is that the very same challenges that the private sector faces. That, if you're the manager of a Social Security Administration call center somewhere in the United States, you're really struggling to train new employees. You're struggling to implement a culture and to bring new people in and to keep people engaged and, frankly, to hold those that aren't performing accountable. So I guess I would just close that out by saying my experience in conversations with public sector leadership is that they're facing the same struggles and the same frustrations in terms of people being in the office.
So I'm going to go to the members here in a moment, but I was thinking about this as it's presented now. It doesn't matter, Ms. Albert, with GSA, if she's got to find a way to figure out what the right size is here, and if the organization, so to speak, if the federal organization doesn't agree or the policies don't reflect what you've stated here, we still have an empty building. And though we might disagree why it's still empty, and there's an accountability for that. But I'll turn to Mr. Edwards here for a question.
Massey can't fix it, no one can.
All right. I could.
Oh, the light's up here.
Exactly.
Where you can't see it.
I could just speak up. Thank you, Mr. Chair. The Oversight and Government Accountability Committee 2 weeks ago heard testimony from OPM that we don't even know how many remote workers that we have in federal government. I think they took a guess that probably more than 50% were back in the office. And we could spend a lot of time today talking about the personnel piece, but I know that this time is dedicated to talking about the building needs. Is there any coordinated effort or any central location that brings those two together? Since OPM couldn't even tell us how many workers were still remote, it seems like it would be very difficult for us to analyze our building needs without that valuable information. So is there a source that we're not aware of? And if not, what recommendation would you have to this committee to get supply and demand lined up?
Anybody, I don't, this is going to turn to Michael. I don't know if that's something you dealt with, but maybe it's an identified shortfall here.
I don't think OPM is any different than any other private employer. We have two major real estate developers and owners on our board, and one from New York City, one from Kentucky, and they are both saying the same thing. Their biggest fear is, actually, they both said the same thing. Number one, this is the worst situation they've ever been through. Part of the reason it's the worst is because they don't know what's going to happen tomorrow. Some of the things you already heard. I mean, the next generation, I have two, well, men now, but children who are men, and they both tell me that their generation is just not going to come back 5 days a week. And I think from what I see in the workforce at the moment, that's probably true. You make somebody come back 5 days a week that doesn't want to, today's world, they can easily find another job, and they will. So I think part of the problem is OPM, like any bureaucracy, sometimes trips over their own feet. But I also don't think they could probably answer the question. Even if they could answer it for today. They won't be able to answer it for tomorrow or 6 months from now, because no one knows. And I don't think it's much different in the private world either.
Did you have anything to add? Oh, you want to be in the queue? Oh, let me see if Nina's got anything to add, Kay, before we come to you. Go ahead on the question.
Well, I'll just say this. Right now, where the pendulum's swinging is not set. And what we're doing to manage through this time, not only given the size of the portfolio, but also given the complexity of the time, is that you're working with each agency on what their plans are. So we've taken an agency-first approach, because how agency X needs to utilize space, how they manage their teams, what their teams need, might be different than what agency Y is. So you can't analyze to a point of pinpointing a number. However, there are agencies that are leading because they are more confident in what their plans are. There's been consolidation activity within the federal community for more than 10 years. And so I'll use St. Elizabeth's, which many around the table are familiar with. There's been an identification of need to reduce lease cost and also consolidate people so that the agency's mission can be better delivered. So we're well-versed in consolidation and how to work within an agency, their HR departments, their real estate folks, the operational side, which frankly drives, I always say that real estate is form following function. So you have to understand the function of the agency to best deliver space. And we're blocking and tackling, Chairman Perry, you mentioned the number of leases that are coming due over the next 5 years. Blocking and tackling those decisions as a decision is merited at this moment. And we're able to save money currently, even when we don't know exactly what a targeted solution might be. So that's how we're managing across the portfolio, and I would say that that mimics how a private sector portfolio manager would also be managing.
But to go to your question, and then I know there's a couple other answers pending here, but I want to go to the gentlelady from Washington, D.C. here. There is no one agency, I don't think, that's determining demand and supply and getting that correct. And if it's anybody right now, it's Nina, but maybe the function of it needs to change or be more.
May I just make a comment?
Sure.
For the members of this committee? And again, I know the discussion is based, the agenda here is to discuss building needs, square footage needs, and that sort of thing. And I'm hearing the talk about the private sector and what they're doing. I believe there's a materially different set of circumstances when it comes to government employees. They don't have the same accountability as the private sector. And I believe there should be no hybrid model in federal government. People need to be at work. They need to be in their office space. My office deals daily with the IRS, Social Security Administration, Veterans Benefits, and so many others because constituents can't get the answers that they need from those agencies. And many times, I believe it's because the people that work in those agencies are on their sofa doing their laundry while they're doing Zooms and walking their dogs and watching Oprah and all that sort of thing that really makes employees unproductive. And I'm certainly in favor of consolidation. I believe that there has to be a way we can reduce the floor space, unused floor space that I've seen here, but I think that we need to do it in a way that would insist that people be at work. We don't need a hybrid model in federal government. We need people at work.
Just hang on to your answers, because I think there'll be a time to get into the discussion with whatever else comes up, plus add that gentlelady from Washington, D.C.
Thank you very much. I have a number of questions for.
Eleanor, your mic, I think your mic cut out, if you can get it back on there.
It's okay? Can you hear me? Commissioner of the Public Building Service, about work going on or not going on in the District of Columbia. The ongoing work at St. Elizabeth's is of great importance to the federal government and will result in significant savings for taxpayers. As you know, DHS is currently housed in more than 50 separate locations throughout the National Capital Region, and more than half of the General Service Administration's operating leases will expire in the next 5 years. If these leases must be extended, or if short-term extensions reach holdover status, the already high cost of the leases will increase. Some of these leases, anticipating a move to St. Elizabeth's, have already entered into short-term extensions. Could you provide a status update on the consolidation of the DHS headquarters at St. Elizabeth's West Campus?
Thank you so much for that. St. Elizabeth's was fortunate last year that in the FY23 budget to be able to move forward on 2 additional headquarters, construction projects. That's CISA's headquarters, as well as INA's headquarters. In addition, we've been able to build out additional infrastructure that's needed at St. Elizabeth's. So last year was an incredibly important funding year in order to be able to see through that consolidation effort. This year, in the President's '24 budget, we're asking for the last phase of building out St. Elizabeth's and have requested additional funds in order to bring on the NAC into St. Elizabeth's. So we are well underway in order to achieve the savings that the DHS consolidation in the National Capital Region has promised for many, many years. That's where we are. Last week, I believe it was, we held a really important event, which was an industry day, which shared with the vendor and buildings community what the program is for construction going forward. It was very well attended, and there's a lot of interest from the marketplace to deliver these projects as quickly as possible.
Well, what are GSA's plans for the old DHS headquarters once everyone moves to St. Elizabeth's?
I don't have those exact plans right now. We are looking at, in every market that we have, in every region, but the National Capital Region is incredibly important just because of the concentration of federal buildings here. So we are looking across our portfolio, systematically going through it, trying to understand what agency headquarters plans are and how we can reposition certain assets to best serve the federal government over the long run, as well as to work with the local community to understand how best to reposition those assets to support the local community's long-term revitalization needs.
Now, the fiscal year 2023 Omnibus Appropriations Bill required GSA to choose among 3 sites in Maryland and Virginia for a new consolidated FBI headquarters. And that's very controversial here in the National Capital Region. The old headquarters on Pennsylvania Avenue could be a prime location for mixed-use development. If the headquarters is moved outside of D.C., what does GSA plan to do with the current headquarters site downtown?
As you know, Congress directed us to consolidate FBI facilities in the NCR into a new suburban campus, and that is the plan that we're operating under, and that's currently under deliberation. As for the J. Edgar Hoover building on Pennsylvania Avenue, we know that that's going to continue to need to be occupied until a new headquarters and campus are delivered. So we don't have immediate plans that we can share because we don't know what they are until we have the funding necessary to execute on the FBI headquarters and campus. But we will assess whether or not the federal government has a long-term need for that site, or whether it makes more sense to dispose of that property and put it back into private circulation.
Eleanor, I'd like to go to Mr. Massey now. We'll come back to you. More questions? Oh, okay, I'm sorry, Derek Randall.
Okay. Thank you very much for coming, Mr. Chairman. Thank you. Ms. Albert, I'm from Wisconsin's 3rd Congressional District. We have 19 whole partial counties, 13,000 square miles. There's 1 GSA building in my district. It took us, after contacting your office, it took us until we started in November on the 2nd. On the 28th, we tried to get the lease done. It wasn't until December 27th that it was finished. We didn't get furniture until February 1st, and our phones didn't get turned on for about 3 weeks after that. So I'm a member of Congress, and we have 1 building that's administered by your administration in my entire district, and it took us a couple months to get the ability to service my constituents. It's wholly unacceptable. There's only 4 GSA buildings that are administered in the state of Wisconsin by your administration. So if a sitting member of Congress can't speak to his constituents literally on a telephone for a couple months, what does the rest of the federal government look like? That's a bit of a rhetorical question. You have 5,500 people working for you right now. How many of those are working remotely?
Well, the public building service, as you know, is predominantly in buildings because we service buildings. So we tend to be a section of GSA that is on-site forward.
So, ma'am, I asked you a very specific question. You have 5,500 people. You told me they're working for you now. How many of them are working remotely at 10:42 on a Wednesday?
I don't have that.
Okay, please get that, because that speaks to the root of the problem. We were trying to fill out my staff in the district, and someone asked me what our remote working policy was, and I said he could use the phone when he goes to the bathroom, and he's not employed by me because he needs to be able to speak directly to constituents, as does your department. Mr. Maroney, according to the memos that we just signed, and our Chairman Graves reauthorized the rents for up to 20 years for the Department of Justice, still use that as an example, for the building at 950 Pennsylvania Avenue. According to those memos that we signed, each individual person is supposed to have 220 square feet per person or less. That building has 1,025,304 square feet. Divided by 220 equals 4,660 employees. Are there 4,660 employees for the Department of Justice at 950 Pennsylvania Avenue? Are there 4,660 employees for the Department of Justice at 950 Pennsylvania Avenue?
I do not know if the number.
Okay, check me out. Again, this is indicative of a real problem. So these are real numbers, 220 square feet or less, 1,225,307 square feet for that specific building at 950 Penn Avenue. So these are documents that we signed at this committee, It's a checkbook that we have. We're authorizing these different departments that are administered by you, ma'am, for a very specific reason. You're a taxpayer, so am I. I want to know if there are 4,660 employees in that building. And let's just use that as an example. I understand this, you guys, it's unwieldy, the bureaucracy that you're working with, and it's unattainable. So I want these answers because my constituents want these answers. Is that clear? I mean, this is your job. When's the last time you audited these guys?
Department of Justice, GSA.
Dude, GSA the whole time. When's the last time we went through this?
We have ongoing audits of GSA currently, and going. We have a current job looking at actually the utilization of federal headquarters buildings in DC, looking at occupancy rates and what the current state of play is.
I get it. I'm asking you a real specific question. When's the last time you audited these guys to see if they're using 220 square foot per person, as in a paper that Chairman Graves signed, giving you guys $23 million? Is that right, Max? It's like 23 million bucks. That's a significant chunk of change. And that's, a single lease. So I want the Government Accountability Office to hold the government accountable. And I'm going to hold you accountable. That's a deal, man. Are we good to go? Thank you. I yield back.
And just to let you know, I think GAO is working on a report that we're going to have on that. And I don't know if it includes things like atriums or whatever that square footage. So not to say that it should or shouldn't, I just don't know. So we should probably know that. I'm going to, because I don't think, are you done? You weren't done, were you? You had more questions?
What?
Eleanor, you had more questions?
Yes.
All right, so I'm going to go to Eleanor and then I'll come back to you, Thomas. All right, go ahead.
I just have a few more questions for Ms. Albert of the Public Building Service. The Daniel Webster School in downtown D.C. has been vacant since the 1980s. What is GSA's plan for that site?
There is an occupant and an interested agency in that site, and so right now we're working with them on what their long-term interests in the building are.
Okay, it's a long time. What steps, if any, has GSA been taking to jumpstart the Southwest Eco District, including selling the Department of Energy's Forrestal building?
So, as I mentioned earlier, we're taking a comprehensive and systematic look, particularly at our facilities in the District of Columbia, trying to understand how to achieve greater efficiencies within this portfolio. So we're engaging right now with all of our agencies, and particularly these headquarters facilities, which are very, very important to mission delivery for agencies. And so we'll have more to share about Forrestal or any other building, later.
Mm-hmm. Finally, let me ask you, the District of Columbia has called upon GSA to release some of its unused federal buildings for the purpose of private development. Will GSA consider doing so?
Yeah, as I said, right now we're looking across our entire portfolio. I like to break it out into 3 buckets. One are, what are the assets that are long-term strategic holds for the federal government, where it does not matter, what the exact occupancy is. What matters is that that facility serves a long-term purpose for the federal government, and we can backfill and manage occupancy over time. So that's one set of assets, and we have to modernize those assets and continue to maintain them. I want to come back to this point in just a moment. The second grouping of assets are those that over the long run have historic underutilization, that have increasing costs to maintain them, and are not a long-term strategic hold. Those assets are the ones that we will put in our disposal pipeline. We've had a long disposal pipeline for some time, and we'll continue to feed that disposal pipeline. We would be delighted to work with the District of Columbia on how to reposition those assets for best use and repositioning for private, public, other kinds of uses. And then there's the middle, which is right now as we're trying to understand how the pendulum will swing and what ultimate utilization is for the next decade. And please note that utilization shifts over time as workforce and workplace trends shift over time. So there's no magic number. But we're managing that middle that we're, trying, as we understand how the pendulum will swing. The part I wanted to come back to is, in order to modernize and maintain existing buildings, those long-term holds, as well as that middle group where we continue to need to serve the federal interest, we need full access to what we call the Federal Building Fund. In the FY24 budget this year, we have proposed amending the Federal Building Fund and how it's treated so that GSA can use the full rents that we receive from agencies to reinvest in buildings that we know we're going to hold over the long run, as well as accelerate consolidations and backfilling vacant space. That's an important concept in order for us to be able to serve the government over the long term.
Go ahead.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. I just want to jump in a little bit. The kinds of things that Eleanor was just talking about, the Daniel Webster building and others, it's exactly what the PBIB was put together for. As a matter of fact, there was a building in Harrisburg that was on our first list, the Ronald Reagan Federal Building, that was sold in a matter of 2 years. And but it takes time and it takes an investment to do that. You need to take the agencies that are there and move them out to a more consolidated location. Some buildings might need environmental remediation with asbestos or whatever it might be. And it does take time to actually physically move any agency from point A to point B. It just takes time and coordination. And it's not one agency. Nobody snaps their finger. You got to deal with 10 different agencies doing 10 different things. It can be done, but they have to be focused. And I guess I want to back up a little bit. One of the problems that I've found in the short time I've been on this board is the lack of a useful list of properties. I actually personally downloaded there's a big acronym for it. I can't remember the name. Joanna would know it. There's hundreds of thousands of federal properties around the country. And it took me about 10 minutes to download it on my little home computer. And the truth is it has more information than you're ever going to want. It's more like an information overload to the point of being, I won't say useless, but just not as helpful as it should be in identifying the very properties that we need to get to. So therefore, we have to rely on members of Congress. We have to rely on local officials. We have to rely on agencies like the GSA. Even then, the local guys might say, hey, Mike, we know a building in Harrisburg that is underutilized and we need to do this. The lack of information has been, it's not that it's lack, but the lack of consolidated, useful information has been very difficult to put our arms around. And I think hinders the ability to actually address the issues you want to address. You may know some of the buildings in yours. Honestly, I downloaded my old district, and there was way more federal property than I realized, and that counts leases and everything else. And the truth is, most of them were like post offices and things like that. The one that amazed me was one of our national parks. One of our national parks was actually made up of hundreds of individual properties, and they're still carried as hundreds of individual properties on this list, which made it almost impossible to figure out which properties are being underutilized. It doesn't mean it can't be done. It's an incredibly labor-intensive job to do that, and it hinders it. But it doesn't mean it can't be done. It just means it takes a little time, and it does take an investment to do it. There's no way we could have done the building in Harrisburg without taking the agencies that were there and moving them out. They don't have the money in their budget to do it. We had to provide those funds, and that's why there's a revolving fund at the PBIB. But there's still some problems with it.
Can I put some numbers to that?
Ms. Sargent, yeah.
All right, so there are 3.2 billion square feet of federal government-controlled space in over 500,000 buildings. Of that, GSA controls about 700 million, which is really only about 30 to 40% of the office space, A lot of it is a variety of different things, and DOD and other agencies control a lot of that other space. If we are just talking about office space, though, Congressman Edwards, I have some bad news for you. You're not going to like what I'm about to say, but I'm the mother of 5 children. I think the hybrid ship, as my good friend here to the right has said, has sailed, because I don't think we're thinking about the bigger picture here. We're talking about office space, and we're looking at the end of the spear. We're not looking at what is actually causing this problem. So I'm going to give you an example, and then I'm going to give you some recommended solutions, I think. I'm going to give myself as an example. I graduated 38 years ago with a degree that was paid for the day I walked out of college. It was to last me my one career that I would have that I thought I would work for 30 years. I had the prospect of being better off than my parents, and I wasn't accessible 24/7. My 5 children are graduating now with a degree that will take them 20 years to pay off. They won't have one career, they'll probably have multiple because careers are evolving so rapidly. They're not gonna work 30 years, they're gonna work 40 or 50 because I already am. And they have the prospect of being accessible 24/7, and that's the expectation, and to be worse off than their parents. Our way of working has changed significantly in the last 30 or 40 years. And the pushback that we're getting from the workforce right now is basically, we can't sustain at this level and go in every single day and give up everything. And so I do believe that there is a reason and a way we can find some balance, that we need to get people into the office more than they're there now, but we also need to find some way to have some balance. And I think Nina is 1,000% right. In what's right for the FBI may not necessarily be right for the IRS. Whether you work remotely or not has nothing to do with whether you want to. It has to do with your job, what is needed of you, and what is required. And some people can do that amazingly well, other people can't. But I'm going to give you 5 things that I think are really important. You also, Senator, are 1,000% right. You can't manage anything you can't measure. We got to get a handle on that. And we got to figure out how we leverage technology to do that. Castle Systems, the people that do all the security, are already telling us that GSA and the government agencies, the attendance and the occupancy in those buildings is about half what we're seeing in the private sector. But even the private sector, we're only at about 30 or 40% occupancy. Now, it wasn't that much better before COVID, quite frankly. We have a lot of underutilized space, and we need to do better. But we also need to stop rewarding people with space. Not everybody needs a dedicated, huge office or a dedicated individual space, especially if you're not going to be there every single day. We need to learn to share. And not every single agency needs a tricked-out gym and a tricked-out conference room when they're right across the street from each other. We need to learn how to leverage the sharing economy and do better and create better spaces in less real estate that are more enticing, that people actually want to be there. So consolidate, but make what you offer better.
Before I turn to Mr. Massey, Eleanor, what was the time frame that you said about this Daniel Webster bill? How long has it been vacant?
The time frame for what?
The Webster building that you mentioned? You said it's been vacant since sometime in, did you say the 80s?
The Webster School was vacant. The Webster School was vacant since the 1980s.
Why hasn't that been sold?
There's complexities with that facility, and there's a high security concern and interest. That is an anomaly. Our average disposal is 3 to 5 years. That requires and includes complying with all the rules that we have to, which have to do with CERCLA, which have to do with going through McKinney-Vento. There's kind of a variety of things that we have to comply with to make a property marketable. All of that requires funds. That's why we've been partnering with the PBRB, under FASTA and others, to raise the awareness of the fact that it takes money to position an asset for
Maybe
sale.
we ought to take a look at that. I'll turn to Mr. Massey.
Thank you, Chairman Perry. Mr. Capano, you described your job as the canary in the coal mine. I appreciate that. Most canaries would not sign up for that job.
You'll find out someday when the speaker calls you, you say yes.
30 years ago, I want to speak to Ms. Albert's qualifications for this job, which I think are high, because 30 years ago, John Sununu came to our campus to speak. And I don't know why I went to listen to a politician speak, but I did. And the only thing I remember in his 1-hour speech is that we need more engineers and fewer attorneys in government. Sorry, Mr. Perry, I think you have a law degree. Okay, sorry. I know I've offended somebody in this room already. I try to do that in the first 30 seconds. But what he said is attorneys are trained to take a position and then go collect facts. But engineers are trained to collect the facts, then come up with the solution after you have the facts. And so I think that's the right approach. And thank you for doing this job, even though you have a mechanical engineering degree. I think that's highly, this present high qualifications for this job. I want to talk about a success story from GSA in the making in my district. This could have gone poorly, but so far it's going well. But there's something that GSA has proposed recently that could threaten the success story. So here's the success story. The IRS had like 4,000 or 5,000 jobs in downtown Covington, Kentucky. They announced they're going to take away 1,500 of those jobs. The mayor was distraught. I was concerned, but because I had sat through these hearings with John Micah of these buildings, right, where there are deer, just like in the antelope, playing on campuses that used to house government, offices, and vines growing on the buildings. And I thought, oh my gosh, what's going to happen to this IRS building? It's 20 acres in downtown Covington. And so the mayor, Joe Meyer, is a visionary, really. He's a grandfather. He could be doing something else with his life. He used to be a state senator, but he signed up to be the mayor of the city, and he dearly loves it. And he said, we'll borrow the money to buy this IRS property. And so we work closely with the mayor and GSA, and you were saying the average time to acquire is like 3 or 5 years. In a year, we got this deal done. In 2019, the IRS is moving out. By 2020, the deal was completed. Now, the mayor's a little bit sore about it, and I am too, because the city gave the property to the IRS 55 years ago and then had to pay tens of millions of dollars to get it back. So good for the GSA. As a conservative, in the federal government, I'm glad you got a pound of flesh for that property and got some money for it. But the mayor, that money is inconsequential. The mayor's going to spend $80 million developing this property and putting in the streets. Remember, it's 20 acres, a single-story IRS building. They're tearing it down, so I didn't bring any pictures of like the progress. We're still in the breaking the eggs to make an omelet stage. The mayor suggested maybe he could make money by renting sledgehammers to people who wanted to take out their grievances on the IRS, and we wouldn't have to get excavators to take it down. But he got the excavators. So this project's moving along. He's going to, instead of bringing in a mega developer, he's going to have multiple developers who are going to spend hundreds of millions of dollars developing this property. It's all moving along very well in spite of COVID. Okay, the IRS didn't completely move out of Covington. They have 2,500 jobs still there. And the mayor is relying on the payroll tax from those to help make this other project a success, taking the GSA property and turning it back into a vibrant part of the city. But recently, in February, the GSA suggested, when they renewed their lease for the IRS on the existing IRS jobs, that they expand it, the area that they're looking to rent for these IRS folks, from that dark area on the map, which is downtown Covington. That's the area delineated and approved by Congress to go look for, the GSA can go look for space there. But the IRS and the GSA came back and suggested a month ago to expand the region to this red line, okay, which is 20 square miles, includes 24 cities. What would happen if the IRS moves 2,500 jobs out of the city, which, by the way, is also suffering from work at home already? I mean, you've got big corporations who are now getting out of the occupational tax by sending their people out of the city. If he loses the revenue from 2,500 IRS employees to outside of the boundaries, it threatens the success story of the other piece of property where the mayor is turning it into a vibrant part of his city. So that's a big concern for me. The other thing is, if the GSA vacates their existing building in downtown Covington, now the mayor has to compete with that space. His new development, taking the old GSA building, which was vacated, now would have to compete, which he bought. Even though they gave it to the IRS, he had to buy it back. He's developing it. Now he's got to compete with another empty building with the loss of payroll revenue. So I guess I'm just saying all this because, number one, I want to point out there are some successes that the city's acquired this property and they're moving forward. But I hope we're not penny wise and pound foolish and vacating all of the rest of the space in Covington and cutting the knees out from under this mayor who's really gone out on a limb and taken out bonds to develop this other GSA property and make it a success story that we can talk about, that the GSA can talk about and say, this is a model for how we do going forward. Now, I will say, we just found out this week, the GSA has announced that they're going to retract their request to expand this delineation to 20 square miles. What I want to know is, hopefully that retraction is permanent and that the GSA will consider all of the factors here involved.
So thank you so much. I think that this is a great example of the complexities of what we try to manage. We originally went out with a solicitation for a new lease for the IRS and had to retract that solicitation because we didn't get enough competition. And, you know, I think it's called the Competition and Contracting Act. We're required to ensure that there's good competition so that federal government gets good price. One of the tools that we have for encouraging or increasing competition is to increase the size of the delineated area, which is where you see this strategy. At this moment in time, we've paused and retracted because we need to engage. There are other tactics for increasing competition, which is doing deeper market research, for example, encouraging people so that they are aware of the opportunity. And so that's, I think, where we are now. We're reassessing how to approach this, trying to make sure that we're looking at all the different tools that are available. I think increasing the delineated area is one of those tools, and we'll work with your office to make sure that we're approaching this marketplace in the right way.
Just real quickly, and I know you got to move on, Chairman. You know, I think it would be unwise to increase the competition around the airport. Like, IRS employees do not need to be in our most valuable property right next to the airport where we've got Amazon distributing goods. They've got a hub there. DHL's got a hub. We got rid of paper filings. We don't need to be at the airport with the IRS. So, and I hope also you'll consider public transportation. A lot of these people, their parents work for the IRS. They're working for the IRS. They live in Cincinnati. They live downtown. If you move this outside of the city, it's, again, you're going to be coming back and asking us for allowance, for commuting allowance, so that they could, you know, Uber out to their work or something. So please keep all of that in mind. I hope the delineation doesn't go outside of the boundaries of Covington, because that would be a double whammy on this mayor who's trying to work with GSA to make a success story for you to come and tell. Thank you.
I almost think this is a Thomas Massey I'm not familiar with, but that's another story. I'm going to recognize the ranking member and Ms. Chavez.
The mayor's a Democrat, too.
Go? Do you mind, Dina, if she's got to go? All right.
And I'm Lori Chavez-Dreamer from Oregon. I'm not the expert at the table. There sounds like you all are, and you have plenty of employees to help out. My comment is, in the 118th Congress, we're facing a $31 trillion debt, and I hope, and I think the basis of what you're here today is to say, how do we have the fiduciary responsibility to the taxpayers to save dollars? I mean, that really is the bottom line, private versus public. And that's my goal. How do we save the taxpayers their dollar? Congressman, thank you for serving. Thank you for being here. You mentioned in your opening statements that there are still barriers to the law, to the flexibility of what the board can do and what they can offer. I don't have time to listen to the answer, and I'm sorry I have to go, but I would like to know what you think the number one barrier is that we need to start with today to fix that problem in order to start to have the flexibility to do this, because I think Kay's right. We are not going to head in the direction to force people back to work 5 days a week. And here we sit at our age. I'm 55 years old. We have not one young person here to ask that question to. Thank you for your stories. I have 29-year-old twins. And exactly, but they're not sitting here giving us their input, and that's just what I'm saying. We're making the decisions, but we're not going to force them back. So what are we going to do to save the taxpayer dollars in order to be the responsibility to the taxpayer? Because they do want access. They want us to be there, but they want this question out, how do we save them dollars? And I think we can't wait as long as 25 years, as Ms. Norton mentioned to get those answers. We have to move quicker, faster. In the technology today, we have the people to do it. Let's just do it.
Just one quick answer to that. Sometimes you got to spend money to save money.
Fair enough. But let's get it done.
And can I just tag on that? Let's get full access to the federal building fund and raise the the prospectus threshold. That will accelerate our ability to manage these properties more efficiently.
The flexible building fund.
And one point of reference, for most companies, 80% of their money goes to their people, only 10% goes to real estate, 10% goes to IT. Everybody looks at squeezing real estate. They don't necessarily think of the impact of what does that do to the people that are in that spaces. If we do anything to negatively impact the productivity of individuals by squeezing too hard, and believe me, there's plenty of room to squeeze, but you gotta have that right balance because real estate is not the biggest bucket.
Thank you. Thank you. Sorry, I have to leave.
The ranking member recognized.
Thank you, Ms. Perry, and thank you for putting together this refresher course. Some of us have been dealing with these same problems for years. I know Ms. Norton has, and I have for a little while. We keep hearing what the problem is, but we don't really keep hearing the solution. Now I hear the solution, we need to spend money to save money. We need to care about federal employees. And I hear agreement on the other side of the aisle. Who are these people? What have you been doing for the last 25 years? I mean, it certainly isn't helping public employees or investing more money, so maybe we're coming to some agreement. I have concern too. Same questions. Do you rent? Do you rent to buy? Do you buy? Do you sell? Do you know, which route do you take? Are people coming back full-time or are they coming back half-time? You got, 1.2 million people across 50 agencies, ranging from animal husbandry to nuclear testing. You're right, one size does not fit all. So how we make this work more efficiently, I don't know. But I do know that when I held the gavel, GSA and GAO were not the most cooperative agencies. Y'all are supposed to be there to help us give better oversight. And it was very difficult pulling information out of you. You became very protective about it. And I think of the whole emoluments clause issue. But we can get back to that. Nice to see you, Mr. Capuano. Thank you for joining this esteemed group. There are a couple of reports that are coming out. Some are required annually, some are requested by this committee. I wonder if y'all might comment on kind of where they are. There's a high-risk list that's coming out pretty soon. There's the design excellence in art and architecture that's coming out soon. And then perhaps the most controversial is the utilization of federal buildings, agency by agency. I know that's coming out, and I know that's going to hit like a bomb. So could y'all kind of give us some idea where those things are?
Yes, be happy to. So first on the high-risk report, that'll be coming out in April. It's our latest update. We do it every 2 years to update. These are the programs that GAO has identified as being the most at risk of either fraud, waste, or abuse, or in need of substantial transformation. Managing federal real property is right on that list, so we will have an update then. We'll take into account what's happened the past 2 years. So there have been some positive actions, some open recommendations have closed, but there have also been some new recommendations related to getting better utilization data on what's going on in buildings, sharing lessons learned about how to improve the disposal process. So we'll be taking that into account. That'll be out in April. In terms of the Design Excellent project, that is wrapping up now as well. We expect to issue a product in June and are currently finalizing our results, are considering potential recommendations. So that'll be coming forth very soon. And then finally, you noted—
What are you looking at in that report?
So we are looking at first the statutory regulatory framework that undergirds that program, the art and architecture, as well as the design excellence. And we're also looking at how the agencies use that to plan and design programs involving
You're not going to make every building look like the Parthenon, are you?
We are assessing how they plan, how GSA and others plan and design based on design excellence. So we'll find out in June with the results. And then finally, on the utilization study, which this committee has requested, we are making progress on that. We have been collecting each month now since January occupancy data for all federal headquarters buildings in the DC area to assess what their occupancy rates are and what that looks like capacity-wise for those buildings to give a sort of sense of where are things right now with those data points. We're finishing up data collection. We'll spend a couple months cleaning up the data. The data is not perfect, so we have to understand the assumptions, the limitations, and also talk with private sector groups about some leading practices to consider and how to assess utilization in space. So we expect to have a product in the coming months, by early summer.
Are you detecting any trends in that as you collect this data?
So it's still early, but it is, there's not a particular trend we are seeing. I would say what we're seeing is similar across federal agencies, relatively low rates, but it varies by agency. Some agencies are higher, some agencies are lower. So it's hard to pinpoint exactly at this point, but we'll know more in a couple months once we've had a chance to clean up the data.
And that'll come with recommendations or just an assessment?
It possibly will. We'll consider recommendations with that. We aren't at the point to know if we will have one or not. We have to see where the evidence lands, but we're certainly considering them.
Look, we're running long, and I appreciate your diligence here. I think it's like a compliment that we're running along. There's a lot of interest in what was probably a dry subject for a lot of people. But before we kind of close here, the emergence of the issue of shadow space, can any of you speak to that and inform the members of the committee that are here? Yeah, go ahead, Chad.
Sure, happy to. We've been following this closely because we think it's going to have a major impact on this market and other markets in the U.S. So the concept of shadow vacancy, two things are happening in the marketplace. There's a reduction in space, as this committee has seen through recent prospectuses, but then there's give back of space, where an agency is giving back space to the GSA, not occupying it anymore. GSA still has a responsibility to pay the landlord rent until the end of the lease term. So shadow vacancy, zombie space, empty. And I don't envy Commissioner Albert, because that's certainly going to be a major challenge to handle that effectively. But what it does is it creates a situation where it exacerbates an already depressed market, where there's a significant amount of vacancy. So the GSA has two options in that case. They either have to let that space stay on the rent rolls and pay for space that isn't being occupied or utilized, or they can backfill it with other agencies. And then that obviously cannibalizes the local leasing market. And that's the concept of shadow vacancy. We did a study. I don't think this is public anywhere, so we've sort of had to get our research team to talk to agencies, figure out what space is being returned or has been returned. We counted about 8 million square feet in Northern Virginia and DC that fall into those two categories. About 4 million is the actual shadow vacancy that is either on the books now or in the process of coming. And so typically, I think, and Ms. Albert might be able to answer this better than me, GSA has had a relatively low vacancy rate in their lease portfolio, 1 to 1.5% on any given year, 5 to 10% in owned space. So I think this is going to be a new phenomenon that we're all going to have to deal with in the private sector as well as at GSA.
Did you have a comment on it? And how fast can you react to? Is that a long lead time to deal with that? Is there anything you can do within the confines of the lease that allows you to do, or is it just, situational?
I'll make 3 points. Number one is that I don't think that the pendulum has rested yet. What trends have been over the last 2 years and what they will be in the next 2 years will remain to be seen, as everyone's trying to figure out what this balance of hybrid is and how best to serve their mission and their customers, as well as their employees. So that's one point that I'll make. So yes, the past 2 years, every single office owner has been dealing with shadow vacancy because nobody's been in the office. I mean, because there was a pandemic and we're all still recovering from that. So that's one thing. How are we managing it? I had mentioned we're blocking and tackling. That's what we're having to do. We have a fiscal and fiduciary responsibility, as do you, to make sure that the federal government is spending wisely and not wasting. And so part of that is making sure that we are, managing long-term leases where the government continues to have an obligation to pay and backfilling it. So we're blocking and tackling as opportunities become clear. When we do have to release space, we're trying to do that responsibly. And that means working with local governments, working with our landlords to make sure that we're not having a negative effect and impact. As you know, the government takes a long time to do things. It costs money to save money. We mentioned that. I'm going to come back to that again because it's such an important concept. But none of our actions are sort of, will take anybody by surprise. We have a 2-year lead time when we're going to be vacating a lease. That gives not only the agency time to move, but as importantly, it gives the landlord and cities a lead time to sort of reposition and figure out what to do. But we would love to move faster. We think it's incredibly important. The way that real estate or major infrastructure owners deal with that is that they need to have what I call dedicated funding. I came from Metro before here. You need to have funding that you can rely on in order to make long-range plans, because moving an agency takes money. It does. It's like you owning your house and deciding to leave and pick up and go. The less stuff you have, the easier it is to move. But the more stuff that you have, and if you've been around for 20 years in a house, it takes time and money to move. And so having that reliable access to the Federal Buildings Fund, increasing the prospectus threshold to be on par with what other landholding agencies have in the government will allow us to move with certainty and to execute on plans, because we know we have a reliable source of funding and have been able to decrease the decision-making process by increasing the prospectus threshold. Those are my 4 points. It is a complicated time, but it's also an important time for us to be communicating more than maybe in the past, Ms. Titus, that we've been able to.
Derek, I want to give you and Tim kind of the last word on anything we might have left out that you should be considering.
I'm sure I'm not worthy, but thank you. Look, no one knows what tomorrow will bring. And we have an enormous amount of data, and we're still unable to get our arms around it. So Commissioner Albert is right about where the pendulum's going to land. But I would say this. In terms of office utilization, California is around 30–35%. Texas is 60–65%. Washington, D.C. is right in the middle. We're a little less than 50%. Now, I don't know. What we've seen is that office utilization rates have increased since the end of 21. A normalcy is beginning to take hold. And what we think we're seeing is that B and C class office buildings are not going to be attractive to new office tenants, okay? So for that reason, DC has the highest rate in the country of office to residential transformation, okay? If you own a B office building or a C office building in DC, one of the things that's exciting is the corner of 20th and K doesn't have to be an office location anymore. In fact, all 5 of K's kids probably want to live at 20th and K because, that way it's easier to get to the office and easier to get to the health club and easier to get to the 14th Street and all that kind of thing. So my point is this. In the long run, it may be that an opportunity will exist for the GSA as it begins to look at potential excess space in a market like Washington, D.C., where there is a very high demand for office space. There's a very high demand for residential space. So, I'm not pessimistic. I don't think that the sky is falling. I think that as we begin to get our arms around the data with regard to what GSA office buildings can and can't do, there will be, at least in Washington, D.C., an opportunity to do what the Congresswoman asked, which is to save the taxpayers a few dollars.
Thanks again for the opportunity to be here. Ms. Titus mentioned it, and you mentioned it also, Chairman Perry, about the complexity of this issue, and that we could probably spend most of the rest of the day talking about it. But I guess I just wanted to emphasize that I think there's some unique opportunities in the marketplace right now. When you take a look at the expense of new construction or the expense of renovating, an old 1950s era federal building versus the fact that, leasing is on sale now. And I really do think there's some opportunities to take advantage of the government's ability to lease space and to do it in a quick, flexible way that allows them to, evolve with the changing needs of federal agencies, but not do it in a way that adds to, adds expense through the federal construction and through the cost. So I think, as Nina pointed out in the beginning, there's the three categories that she talks about. There's kind of the long-term holds, there's the stuff they need to get rid of, and then there's that stuff in the middle. And I think that stuff in the middle is where there's probably a lot of opportunity to use leasing as a strategy, given the current market conditions. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. Again, we've gone long. I apologize for that, but obviously some interest in the subject. It's been informative for us that are going to try and have to figure this out, but we will appreciate your involvement in that, and we'll probably elicit and solicit it on occasion as well. So and I would say this too, don't wait for us. Members are busy, staff's busy, so don't wait for us. If you've got an idea or a thought, I know you're advocating. Michael, you're usually pretty shy, but this might be the time, and there's a couple things here that I think we've identified that could probably use a little more work. So we want to get to this, and as Ms. Chavez-DeRemer said, we got a big debt, and this seems to be a place where we should be able to do better, and with a little bit of collaboration, I think we can. So I appreciate everybody's time. Thanks for your attendance and your expertise and your willingness to impart this information to us. And with that, committee is adjourned. Thank you.
Pleasure meeting you. Yeah, take care.